Picture yourself standing in the quiet halls of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. A soft hum from the overhead track lighting is the only sound. Glass cases line the walls, each one a silent guardian of fragments from worlds that no longer exist. Your footsteps echo on the polished floors as you move through rooms filled with pottery shards, bronze tools, and stone tablets covered in cuneiform. Those wedge-shaped marks that look more like the tracks of birds than any form of writing. In the corner of the Mesopotamian gallery, a small, four-sided clay prism rests on a pedestal. It's only about 20 centimeters tall, roughly 8 inches, and its faces are covered entirely in cuneiform script, those strange triangular impressions pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago. The label identifies it as the Weld-Blundell prism, circa 1800 BCE. Most visitors walk right past it without a second glance. But this unassuming object holds something that should make us all pause. It contains what might be the most unsettling historical document ever discovered. A list of kings, a chronicle of rulers who governed the ancient land of Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq. The list details 8 kings who ruled before a great flood swept over the land. Then, it lists 134 more kings who reigned after the waters receded. The unsettling part isn't the number of kings. It's how long they reigned. The first king, Alulim, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alaljar, for 36,000 years. King after king, reign after reign, stretches for tens of thousands of years. The reigns of these 8 kings, when added together, span an impossible 241,200 years. Then, according to the tablet, the flood swept over everything. After the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven once more. But something had fundamentally changed. The kings who came after the flood lived shorter lives. Still impossibly long by our standards, hundreds of years, sometimes over 1,000, but nothing remotely close to the reigns of the antediluvian rulers, the ones who lived before the flood. As you continue down the list, through more and more reigns, the numbers shrink further. 700 years, 400, 200, until finally, by the time we reach kings we can verify through other historical records, the reign lengths match normal human lifespans. It reads like a civilization slowly forgetting how to live forever. Tonight, as the world quiets and your thoughts begin to drift, we're going to explore what this clay prism might be telling us. Not about mythology, not about ancient exaggerations or symbolic numbers, but about something far more profound. What if this list isn't a myth at all? What if it's a compressed record of something real? A memory of civilizations that rose and fell long before Sumer, each one rising higher than the last, each one eventually swept away. Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every single word. Some nights you'll drift in and out of focus. That's perfectly fine. This is a journey for wanderers. For those who lie awake wondering if the history we've been taught is the complete story. For those who sense that beneath the official narrative, something ancient awaits. If this journey through shadow and deep time resonates with you, fellow wanderer, a gentle light helps other seekers find these stories. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What hour marks your descent into sleep? Let me know in the comments. Now let us descend into the archive, into the dust, into the question that haunts every civilization. What came before? The clay feels cool beneath your fingertips. Imagine holding one of these Sumerian tablets. 4,000 years of history preserved in hardened mud. The scribe who pressed these marks into the soft clay did so with purpose, with a sense of reverence. This was not a casual record. This was a sacred chronology. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4,500 BCE, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They built the first cities we know of, Eridu, Uruk. They invented the wheel, developed complex irrigation, and created the first known system of writing. They gave us the concept of time divided into hours, minutes, and seconds. The mathematics we use to measure circles, the foundations of the calendar we still follow, by every archaeological measure, they were the beginning of civilization. But they themselves claimed they were not the beginning. In the opening lines of the king list, the text states simply, after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not kingship began or kingship was created. It descended, came from somewhere else, somewhere higher. Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, and perhaps the oldest city on earth. When archaeologists excavated its ruins at Tel Abu Sharain in Iraq, they found something remarkable. Layer upon layer of temples, each built directly on top of the ruins of the one before, stretching back to around 5,400 BCE. 17 temples, stacked one atop another, each generation meticulously rebuilding what the previous had built, maintaining the same sacred geometry, the same orientation, as if following a blueprint that predated them all. And beneath the very lowest temple, beneath the oldest foundations, the archaeologists found something else. A thick layer of clean silt, river sediment nearly 10 feet deep in some places. It was the unmistakable signature of a massive, devastating flood. Then, below that flood layer, they found more evidence of human habitation. Older pottery, different styles, the remnants of a people who lived before the deluge, before the Sumerians as we know them even existed. The British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated the city of Ur in the 1920s and 30s, found similar flood deposits at multiple sites across Mesopotamia. Not everywhere, but at Ur, at Uruk, at Kish, at Shuruppak. Each city showed evidence of a catastrophic inundation around 2900 BCE, a clear line separating older settlements from the newer ones built on top. The physical evidence on the ground matches what the clay tablets say. There was a time before, then there was a flood, then there was a time after. But the king list suggests something more. Those 8 antediluvian kings, ruling for nearly 250,000 years. What if they represent something we've forgotten how to interpret? Modern scholars dismiss the numbers as mythical, symbolic, impossible. And if we insist they represent the lifespans of individual human beings, they are indeed impossible. No human lives for 30,000 years. Not within our understanding of biology, of cellular decay, of mortality. But what if we're reading it wrong? What if those numbers don't represent individual lifespans, but something else entirely? What if they represent dynasties, eras, entire cycles of civilization rising and falling, all compressed into the symbolic reigns of archetypal kings? Consider how we talk about history now. We speak of the Victorian era, as if Queen Victoria personally shaped every aspect of those decades. We refer to the Renaissance as a single, coherent period, even though it spanned centuries and countless individual lives. We compress vast stretches of time into symbolic figures. The ancient mind did this even more naturally. For them, time was not a straight line. It was cyclical, repeating, mythic. Kings were not just political rulers. They were cosmic figures, axis points around which entire ages turned. So when the Sumerian scribe wrote that Alulum ruled for 28,800 years, some researchers propose he might have meant something like, asterisk during the first great age, when kingship first came to earth, there was an epoch of order that lasted for immeasurable generations. We call this the age of Alulum. Asterisk, and when he wrote that the flood swept over, the text could imply, asterisk, then came a great disruption, a cataclysm that reset the world, after which everything began again. Smaller, newer, diminished. This interpretation, while not accepted by mainstream scholarship, unlocks something haunting. The pattern encoded in the king list, long ages of splendor, a world-altering cataclysm, followed by shorter, lesser ages, matches patterns found in other ancient traditions, from cultures that had no contact with Sumer, no way of sharing stories across vast oceans and language barriers. Let's step away from Mesopotamia for a moment. Let's travel east to the Indus Valley and the sacred texts of ancient India. Here we find the Hindu concept of the yugas, for great ages through which the world cycles endlessly. There is the Satya Yuga, the Age of Truth, the Treta Yuga, the Silver Age, the Dvapara Yuga, the Bronze Age, and the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the Age of Darkness in which, according to Hindu tradition, we currently live. Each yuga is shorter than the one that came before it. In each successive age, humanity and civilization decline in virtue, in lifespan, and in spiritual power. In the Satya Yuga, humans were said to live for thousands of years, possess great wisdom, and walk in harmony with divine forces. By the time of the Kali Yuga, lifespans are short, violence is common, and ignorance prevails. The proportions are precise, following a descending ratio of 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. The Satya Yuga, the longest, is said to last 1,728,000 years. The Treta Yuga is shorter, at 1,296,000 years. The Dvapara Yuga continues the decline at 864,000 years. And finally, the Kali Yuga lasts 432,000 years. Together, they form a single Mahayuga, a great age spanning 32 million years. Then, after the Kali Yuga reaches its darkest point, the world is destroyed and reborn. The cycle begins again with a new Satya Yuga, a new golden age. This is not linear time. This is the great wheel, turning eternally. And here is what should make us pause. The structure of the Hindu yugas eerily mirrors the structure of the Sumerian king list. Long, magnificent ages before a cataclysm, followed by shorter ages after, showing a progressive decline in some essential quality, whether that quality is virtue, wisdom, or simply the capacity to live. Two ancient civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, both preserving the same fundamental pattern. Long ages, cataclysm, shorter ages, reset. The ancient Greeks had their own version in the 5 ages of man. There was the Golden Age, when humans lived like gods, free from toil and suffering. Then came the Silver Age, still peaceful but less wise. Next, the Bronze Age, warlike and violent. Then the Heroic Age, the time of the great heroes of Greek myth. And finally, the Iron Age, their own present, which they saw as characterized by moral decay and endless labor. The poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, placed himself squarely in the Iron Age and lamented that he wished he had been born in an earlier time. He looked backward with longing, not forward with hope. The pattern repeats in Norse mythology, with the cyclical destruction and rebirth of the world through Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The world tree, Yggdrasil, binds together 9 realms that will all burn and then be born again from the ashes. In ancient Persia, the Zoroastrian tradition spoke of world ages of 3,000 years each, 12,000 years in total, after which the world would be perfected and time itself would end. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Mayans both preserved calendars based on vast cycles of time. The Aztecs spoke of the 5 suns, each representing a different world age, and each ending in catastrophic destruction. The current world, they believed, was the 5th sun, doomed, like the others, to eventually perish. The Mayan long count calendar, which caused so much apocalyptic anxiety back in 2012, was tracking a cycle of roughly 5,125 years. But the Mayans themselves knew this was merely one Baktun, one cycle within much larger cycles. Above the Baktun was the Picton, lasting nearly 8,000 years. Above that, the Kalabtun, lasting over 150,000 years, and above that, the Kinchilton, spanning over 3 million years. They were thinking in deep time, in cycles within cycles within cycles, like cosmic wheels grinding through ages most of us can barely imagine. If you're still with me, wonderful. If you've drifted, that's fine too. Let these ideas wash over you like water, like the flood itself. This is for those who wonder, for the seekers in the dark. Across the globe, from Mesopotamia to India, from Greece to Scandinavia to Mexico, cultures that never met, that spoke different languages, that had no known trade routes or communication with each other, all told the same essential story. There were ages before this one. Long ages, golden ages, ages when humans lived differently, knew more, and lived longer. Then came a catastrophe. A flood, a fire, a great destruction. The world was reset, and we began again, smaller, younger, with less knowledge than we had before. Why would they all tell this story if there wasn't some core truth embedded within it? The standard explanation is the convergent evolution of myth. Humans everywhere experience floods, fires, and natural disasters. We all fear death. We all experience a sense of cultural decline as we age and see the younger generation as less disciplined than our own. So, we project these universal human experiences onto cosmic timescales, creating myths of golden ages and subsequent apocalypses. This explanation is neat. It's rational. It might even be partially true, but it doesn't quite account for the specificity of the accounts. The precise mathematical ratios in the Hindu yugas, the exact reign lengths in the Sumerian king list, the detailed descriptions of what life was like in those earlier ages. These aren't vague once-upon-a-time stories. They contain data, structure, mathematics, names, and chronologies. What if they're not just psychological projections? What if they're memories? Not perfect memories, certainly not literal histories in the way we write history now, but cultural memories, passed down through oral tradition for so long that the stories became mythologized, the numbers became sacred, and the events became divine interventions rather than natural processes. But beneath the layers of mythology, a core of truth remains. There were civilizations before the ones we know, and they ended. The geological record supports this possibility. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the world experienced dramatic and violent climate change. Massive ice sheets that had covered North America and Europe for tens of thousands of years began to melt with terrifying speed. Global sea levels rose by over 300 feet. Coastlines where human populations had likely thrived for millennia were inundated, submerged beneath the expanding oceans. This period of catastrophic melting, known to geologists as meltwater pulse 1, happened with astonishing speed, unfolding over just a few centuries. For the people living through it, it would have felt like the end of the world. Their villages swallowed by rising waters, their hunting grounds transformed into seas, their entire world fundamentally and irrevocably changed. If there had been advanced coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, and this remains speculative, though coastlines have always provided the richest resources for human settlement, they would have been destroyed utterly. Their remains now lie hundreds of feet underwater, largely inaccessible to modern archaeology. We know that anatomically modern humans have been around for at least 200,000 years. Behaviorally modern humans, people with the same intelligence, creativity, and capacity for innovation as us, have existed for perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 years. That's 50,000 years of people just like us, living and dying, building and creating. And yet, we have solid archaeological evidence for what? The last 10,000 years, maybe? The rise of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, the first cities in Sumer, the early dynasties of Egypt. That leaves a gap of 40,000 to 60,000 years completely unaccounted for. What were humans doing all that time? The standard narrative says they weren't doing much. They were hunter-gatherers, living in small, nomadic bands, moving from place to place, leaving behind little more than some cave paintings and stone tools. No cities, no writing, no complex civilization. But what if some of them did build complex societies? Perhaps not global empires, but localized, regional cultures with sophisticated trade networks, astronomical knowledge, and rich oral traditions. And what if those cultures, built along the fertile coastlines of the Ice Age world, were simply erased when the ice melted? We would have almost no way of finding them. The ocean does not preserve architecture well. Stone foundations are broken apart by currents. Organic materials decay. After 12,000 years underwater, even monumental structures would be reduced to ambiguous rock formations that are easily dismissed as natural geology. There are hints, though, anomalies that don't quite fit the accepted timeline. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive, circular stone temples built around 9,500 BCE. They feature intricately carved pillars weighing over 15 tons each, sophisticated astronomical alignments, and evidence of large-scale social organization. This was built by people who were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers. The site's sheer sophistication challenges our traditional narratives about the linear progression from simple to complex societies. Then, around 8000 BCE, the temples were deliberately and painstakingly buried. Someone went to enormous effort to cover these magnificent structures with thousands of tons of dirt, as if to preserve them for a distant future. Why? Gunung Padang in Indonesia, a massive terrace pyramid that some researchers argue contains megalithic chambers dating back possibly 20,000 years or more, based on deep core drilling and seismic surveys that remain subjects of intense debate. Mainstream archaeologists dispute this interpretation, dating the visible construction layers to much more recently. The deeper layers remain a profound mystery. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Enormous underwater stone structures that feature flat terraces, sharp right angles, and what appear to be deliberately cut steps. Most geologists argue these are natural rock formations shaped by unique geological processes. Some researchers, however, insist that certain features are undeniably artificial. If any portion of it proves to be man-made, it would have been constructed during the last ice age, when that area was above sea level. Though this remains highly controversial, the questions persist. These anomalies exist on the fringes of our knowledge, dismissed or explained away by mainstream archaeology. Perhaps correctly, perhaps not. The point is not that any one of these sites definitively proves the existence of an advanced Ice Age civilization. The point is that the possibility exists. The door is not entirely closed. And ancient cultures around the world seem to be telling us that the door should be wide open. They are telling us, look backward. Look deeper. What you think is the beginning is not the beginning. Now let's return to the Sumerian king list. Let's take those antediluvian kings seriously for a moment. Not as literal individuals, but as epochs, as the great ages of a lost civilization. If we adopt an interpretation that some researchers have proposed, though it is not the mainstream view, the timeline looks something like this. The first era, the age of Alulum. This is the founding age, the time when kingship descended from heaven. This could represent the very first emergence of organized human society. Small settlements becoming villages, villages becoming towns. The slow, multi-millennial transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural communities, all compressed into the symbolic reign of one archetypal king. The second era, the age of Alalger. Consolidation. The first towns grow into small cities. Trade networks begin to form. Social hierarchies become more complex. Another long epoch of development unfolds. Through 8 such eras, each building on the last civilization grows in complexity, in population, in technical knowledge. Arts flourish, astronomy develops, mathematics, architecture, metallurgy, all slowly advancing over vast stretches of forgotten time. And then catastrophe, the flood. Whether it was a literal flood, a climate disaster, a pandemic, a war, or some combination of them all, the chain of progress breaks. The population collapses. Knowledge is lost. Cities are abandoned. But not everything is lost. Survivors carry fragments of the old world forward. Stories, techniques, the memory of how things used to be, even if the deep understanding of why is gone. And so they rebuild. Smaller, younger, starting again, but not from zero. They have seeds from the old world, literal seeds of crop species that took thousands of years to domesticate, and metaphorical seeds of myths, stories, and half-remembered technologies. They build Eridu. They build Uruk. They create Sumerian civilization, the first civilization as we know it. But they know, and their most sacred records state clearly, that they are not the first. They are the heirs of something far older. This pattern, rise, fall, rise again from the ashes, could have repeated not just once but multiple times. Each cycle leaving fainter traces than the last. Each civilization rising to different heights, falling in different ways, passing on different fragments of knowledge to its successors. If we take this cyclical view of history seriously, if we accept the pattern encoded in myths worldwide, we arrive at a profoundly disturbing possibility. We are not the first advanced civilization on Earth. We might not even be the second or the third. We might be the 7th or the 10th or the 70th. Each previous civilization rose as high as it could with the resources and knowledge available to it, then fell to war, to disease, to climate change, or to some other catastrophe we cannot even imagine. each left behind traces. Enigmatic stones that puzzled the next civilization. Myths that were misunderstood, technologies that were lost and had to be reinvented from scratch. And each time, the survivors looked upon the ruins of what came before and told their children. Once, there was a golden age. Once, people lived longer, knew more, and built greater things than we. Then came the flood, the fire, the darkness. And now, we must begin again. Let your breathing slow. Let these ideas drift like sediment settling at the bottom of an ancient sea. Whether you believe any of this or not doesn't matter right now. What matters is the possibility. The opening of the door. The temperature drops as evening settles over ancient Mesopotamia. Let the scene shift. Imagine you are in a scribal school in the ancient city of Nippur, around 1900 BCE. You are an apprentice scribe, perhaps 14 years old. Your fingers are stained with the black ink used for practice on broken pottery shards. But today you have been allowed to approach the master's workspace. He sits cross-legged on a reed mat, a fresh tablet of wet clay before him. This isn't practice. This is sacred work. He is copying the king list, that ancient chronicle that every scribe must preserve exactly as it was given, without variation, without error. You watch his stylus move, each wedge pressed with perfect depth and angle, the signs emerging on the clay like birds landing on mud. Asterisk and lugal. Asterisk the kingship. Asterisqued. Asterisk descended. The word for descended uses a sign that looks like something falling from above. Why? You whisper, because students may ask questions when the master is in good humor. Why did the first kings live for so long? The master doesn't pause in his work. Because time itself was different then, he says, his voice a low murmur. Or perhaps we simply measure it differently now. Perhaps those were not kings but ages. Or perhaps the gods walked among mortals then and shared with them their very breath. For different answers, all of them true, none of them complete. He finishes a line and looks up at you. The numbers are sacred, he says. We preserve them because those who came before us preserved them. What they mean, he gestures at the tablet, at the impossible figures. What they mean changes with each generation. But the numbers themselves must not change. Do you understand? You nod, though you don't. Not fully. Not yet. The world has ended before, the master says, returning to his work. It will end again. Our task is to preserve so that when it begins anew, something remains. The clay dries. The tablet is fired in a kiln. It survives for 4,000 years, waiting in the earth until German archaeologists uncover it, brush the dirt away, photograph it, catalog it, and interpret it. And still, the question remains. What do the numbers mean? Let that question hang in the air as you drift. Feel the imagined weight of clay in your hands. Smell the dust of ancient Nippur. Hear the scratch of a reed stylus on wet mud. What do the numbers in the Sumerian king list really mean? For over a century, scholars have debated this very question. Some argue they are purely symbolic, sacred numbers with no historical basis whatsoever. The Sumerians, after all, used a sexagesimal-based 60 mathematical system, the very one that gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. Many of the reign lengths in the king list are multiples of 60 or of 3,600, 60 squared, a unit the Sumerians called a sar. 1 sar equals 3,600. 10 sars equal 36,000. The reigns of the antediluvian kings break down into these units with remarkable precision. This pattern strongly suggests the numbers were chosen for their mathematical elegance, not their historical accuracy. Fair enough. But that raises another question. Why these particular numbers? Why not just say a very long time or countless years? Why assign such precise mathematical values if they are purely symbolic? Another theory proposes that the numbers represent something astronomical. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, and understood the Earth was a sphere. The number 25,920, a figure remarkably close to several of the king list's reign lengths, is profoundly significant. It is, approximately, the number of years it takes for the Earth's axis to complete one full cycle of precession. The slow wobble that changes which stars are visible from different points on Earth over millennia. If the reigns of the antediluvian kings encode these vast astronomical cycles, the king list transforms into a kind of cosmic clock, tracking not individual lifespans but the great turning of the heavens. This interpretation makes a certain kind of sense. Ancient peoples often conflated earthly kings with celestial bodies. The pharaohs of Egypt were identified with Horus, the sun god. The emperors of China ruled through the mandate of heaven. Kingship was not merely political. It was cosmic, a bridge linking human order to universal order. A third interpretation is more literal, albeit with an adjustment. Perhaps the Sumerians used a different unit for counting years, not solar years as we know them, but lunar months, seasons, or some other forgotten unit of time. If we divide the antediluvian reign lengths by 12, converting years to months, or by 4, converting them to seasons. We arrive at numbers that are still long, but not entirely impossible. King Alulim's 28,800 years becomes 2,400 months, or 200 years. Still an impossibly long reign for a single individual, but perhaps plausible for an entire dynasty. King Alalngar's 36,000 years becomes 3,000 years under this conversion. Again, plausible for a succession of rulers treated as a single lineage. This interpretation assumes that later scribes, copying the king list centuries after its composition, simply forgot what the original time units meant and misinterpreted them as solar years, creating the impossibly long reigns we see today. But there is a fundamental problem with all these rational explanations. They fail to account for the pattern. After the flood, the king list continues with more kings, and their reign lengths begin to gradually decrease. This isn't random or erratic. It is a clear, progressive decline. The first king after the flood is said to have ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by our standards, but significantly shorter than the 28,800 years of Alulim. As we move through the post-flood dynasties, the reign lengths continue to drop. 900 years, 600 years, 400 years. By the time we reach dynasties that can be cross-referenced with other historical records, dynasties whose kings left behind their own inscriptions, whose cities we can excavate and date, the reign lengths have decreased to realistic numbers. Gilgamesh, the famous hero king of Uruk, who may have been a real historical figure, is listed as reigning for 126 years. Still long, but within the realm of possibility if we allow for some exaggeration or if the reign includes a period of regency. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the reigns are completely normal, 20 years, 35 years, 11 years. Human lifespans. This progressive decline mirrors exactly what we see in Genesis with the biblical patriarchs. Adam lived 930 years. Noah, 950. After the flood, Abraham lived 175 years, and Moses 120. By the time of King David, lifespans had normalized to what we recognize as human. This pattern also mirrors the Hindu yugas, where each successive age sees a decline in human lifespan and virtue. Different cultures, different traditions, yet the same fundamental pattern emerges, as if they are all remembering the same essential truth. There was a time when things were different, when people lived longer or seemed to. A time when civilization was greater or seemed to be, and that time ended catastrophically. What came after was diminished. Imagine being a Sumerian scribe in 900 BCE, meticulously copying this ancient text. You know your grandfather lived about 60 years. You know the current king has reigned for maybe 20. But the text in front of you, passed down through generations of scribes, insists that kings once ruled for thousands of years. Do you dismiss it as fantasy? Or do you trust that the ancients knew something, meant something that you don't fully understand? The scribe copies it faithfully, preserves the impossible numbers, and passes them forward, trusting that future generations will decode their meaning. And here we are, 4,000 years later, still trying to decode it. For those still drifting with me through this ancient labyrinth, remember, you don't need to understand everything. Let the patterns wash over you. Let the numbers resonate like a half-remembered song. What matters is not whether we can prove the antediluvian kings were real in a literal sense. What matters is that the Sumerians believed they were transmitting something true and important, something worth encoding in sacred mathematics and preserving in clay. Now, we must speak of the flood itself. Every ancient culture has a flood myth. This statement, while broad, holds substantial truth. Over 200 distinct flood narratives have been documented by anthropologists, with some researchers counting as many as 300 or more, from every inhabited continent, from cultures that appear to have had no contact with each other. The details vary, but the core remains constant. The world became wicked, or overpopulated, or too noisy. The gods, or God, or the spirits, decided to destroy it with water. One righteous man was warned. He built a boat. He saved his family and animals. The flood came. Everything else perished. The waters receded. The survivors rebuilt. The oldest version we have in writing is from Sumer, the Epic of Ziusudra, dating to around 1600 BCE but based on far older oral traditions. Ziusudra, a pious king, receives a warning from the god Enki that the Council of Gods has decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Enki instructs him to build a great boat. Ziusudra survives along with his family and animals. After 7 days and 7 nights, the flood ends. Ziusudra is granted immortality and taken to dwell in Dilmun, a paradise at the edge of the world. The same story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the survivor is named Utnapishtim. Same warning, same boat, same result. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic, dating to the 18th century BCE, gives more detail. The gods created humans to do labor for them, but humanity multiplied and became too noisy. The god Enlil couldn't sleep because of the human commotion. He decided to destroy them, first with plague, then with drought, and finally with a flood. But Enki, who had helped create humans, warned one wise man, Atrahasis, and told him to build a boat. The flood came. Atrahasis survived. When the gods realized what they'd done, destroyed their own workforce, they regretted it. They decided to limit human population through natural means rather than total destruction, introducing mortality, miscarriage, and celibacy as population controls. These Mesopotamian flood stories appear to be the source material for the biblical flood of Noah, written down centuries later. The parallels are striking. The dimensions of the boat, the sending out of birds to find land, the sacrifice offered after the waters recede. Whether this represents direct literary borrowing or a shared cultural memory of actual floods remains debated, but the connections suggest a profound relationship between the traditions. But here is what should give us pause. The flood myths are global, not merely regional. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, who is warned by Vishnu in the form of a fish about a coming deluge. Manu builds a boat, rides out the flood, and becomes the progenitor of the new human race. In Greek mythology, Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Prometheus warns his son, Deucalion, who builds a chest, essentially a boat, and survives with his wife, Pyrrha. They land on Mount Parnassus and repopulate the earth by throwing stones behind them, which become people. In Norse mythology, the world is born from a flood of blood. When the gods kill the primordial giant Ymir, his blood drowns all the frost giants except for two, who survive in a wooden vessel and repopulate their kind. In China, the story of Gun Yu describes a great flood that covered the land for generations. Yu the Great spends decades working to control the waters, digging channels and creating river systems to drain the floodwaters away. In Australia, various Aboriginal nations have flood stories. The Gumbayngur people tell of a time when the sea suddenly rose, flooding coastal areas where people had lived. They say the waters came from the south, driven by a fierce wind. In North America, the Ojibwe tell of a great flood sent to purge the world. A man named Wainabushu survives by floating on a log with various animals. In South America, the Inca preserve stories of a flood that destroyed earlier peoples. The creator god Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca after the deluge to create a new world. Why? Why would cultures that never met, separated by vast oceans and continents, all tell versions of the same essential story? The standard academic explanation is that floods are a common, universal human experience. Rivers overflow their banks. Tsunamis strike coastlines. Violent storms cause localized flooding. Every culture experiences these natural disasters, so every culture develops a flood mythology to explain them. This explanation works well for localized myths, but it doesn't quite account for the global scale or for the incredibly specific pattern. The world is destroyed, one family survives, and civilization begins again. That's not just, we had a bad flood once. That is the story of the entire world ending and restarting. There are two main possibilities for why these myths are so universal. The first is that they represent a cultural memory of an actual global catastrophe. The most likely candidate is the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, when massive ice sheets melted and sea levels rose dramatically. This wasn't a sudden, single deluge. It happened over centuries. But from the perspective of the people living through it, watching coastlines disappear, islands sink, and valleys flood as rivers swelled beyond anything previously experienced, it would have felt like the end of the world. And crucially, it was a global event. Every coastline on Earth was affected. Every river system changed. Every human population living in lowland areas would have had to migrate inland or to higher ground. If humans had developed any kind of coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, and archaeological evidence is difficult to obtain, since coastlines provide optimal resources for early settlements, those civilizations would have been completely submerged. Their potential sites now lie under hundreds of feet of water and sediment, largely beyond the reach of conventional archaeology. The survivors would have passed down stories. Once we lived in a great land, then the waters came. We barely escaped. After generations of oral transmission, these stories would have become myths. The actual mechanism, gradual sea level rise, would be compressed into a flood came. The timescale of centuries would become 7 days and 7 nights, or 40 days and 40 nights. The geographic specificity would be lost, generalized to the whole world. But the core memory would remain. There was a time before, then came the water, then came the time after. The second possibility is independent invention. Humans everywhere experience traumatic floods. Our brains are wired to remember trauma and encode it in story. We're also wired to see patterns, to create narratives that explain our origins and give meaning to suffering. So, independently, in India and Mesopotamia, in Greece and Australia and Mexico, people created similar flood narratives because they are psychologically and structurally satisfying. They explain why the world is the way it is. They provide a mechanism for cosmic renewal. They reinforce moral codes. Be righteous or be destroyed. Both explanations are plausible. Perhaps both are partially true. Perhaps some flood myths stem from an actual memory of Ice Age catastrophe, while others are later inventions that borrowed the narrative structure because it resonated so deeply. But there's a third possibility, a more unsettling one, that we should at least consider. What if the flood myths are remembering not one catastrophe, but many? What if catastrophic resets are the norm for human civilization, not the exception? What if every few thousand years something happens, a climate shift, a pandemic, a war, an asteroid impact, a volcanic eruption, that collapses whatever civilization has built itself up? And each time, survivors tell the story of how the world ended and they lived. And each time, the details change, but the pattern remains. If this is true, then we aren't remembering one ice age flood. We are remembering a cycle. Rise, peak, collapse, survive, rebuild, and rise again. And the civilizations doing the remembering are not the first. They are merely the latest in a long, forgotten series, each one looking back at the ruins of the one before, trying to make sense of what happened, preserving the memory in the only way they know how, through story, through myth, through sacred numbers pressed into clay. If you have drifted away, that is okay. Come back now, gently. We are moving into stranger territory, into the question that might matter most. If there were civilizations before us, if the pattern of rise and fall has repeated multiple times, how many times? How many cycles? The Sumerian king list implies at least 2 major cycles, before the flood and after. But if the antediluvian kings represent compressed eras, multiple civilizations could be encoded in those 8 names. The Hindu yugas cycle endlessly through 4 repeating ages. After each Kali Yuga comes destruction, then rebirth into a new Satya Yuga. The texts say we are currently in the Kali Yuga of the current cycle, which began in 3102 BCE and will last 432,000 years. After that, a new cycle begins. But above this Mahayuga, the 4-age cycle are even larger cycles. 1,000 Mahayugas make a kalpa, a single day of Brahma, lasting for 32 billion years. At the end of a kalpa, the universe is destroyed and recreated. The scale is cosmic, with cycles within cycles, suggesting a universe that breathes, expanding and contracting, creating and destroying, endlessly. If we apply this cyclical thinking to human civilization, as some speculative researchers have proposed, though this remains outside mainstream archaeology, a pattern emerges. First civilization, emerging from hunter-gatherer bands, developing agriculture, building the first permanent settlements. This might correspond to what we call the Neolithic Revolution, beginning around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. Small communities learning to farm, to domesticate animals, to stay in one place. But this civilization is localized. It doesn't spread far. Climate change, disease, or conflict causes it to collapse before it can develop beyond a certain point. Second civilization, survivors rebuild. They have agricultural knowledge, passed down from their parents. They resettle, this time spreading more widely. Trade networks form between villages. Pottery develops. Metallurgy begins, first with copper, then bronze. This civilization rises higher than the first. It develops writing, rudimentary mathematics, social hierarchy. But it too falls. War between rival groups, drought, plague. The collapse is regional but devastating. Third civilization. Again, survivors rebuild with the fragments. This time they spread even further. Cities emerge. Different regions develop unique cultures and languages. Empires form and compete. This cycle might correspond to what we think of as the Bronze Age civilizations. The Minoans, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, early Egypt. They traded across the Mediterranean, developed sophisticated arts, and built palaces and temples. And then, around 1200 BCE, they all collapsed almost simultaneously. The late Bronze Age collapse is one of history's great mysteries. Cities burned. Trade networks shattered. Writing systems were forgotten. Population declined dramatically. The survivors called the destroyers the Sea Peoples. But who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they destroy everything? We don't know. We only know that after the collapse, the Mediterranean world entered a dark age lasting several centuries. When civilization re-emerged, it was different. Iron instead of bronze, new languages, new cultures, Greece, Phoenicia, Israel, arising from the ashes of what came before. Fourth civilization, the Iron Age, the classical world of Greece, Rome, Persia, India, and China. This is the civilization we think we know, philosophy, literature, engineering on a grand scale, empires spanning continents. And then it, too, declined. Rome fell. The Gupta Empire collapsed. The classical age ended and medieval dark ages began in Europe, though civilization continued elsewhere, in the Islamic world, in China, in Mesoamerica. Fifth civilization, the medieval period through the Renaissance. A slow rebuilding. Universities, the printing press, ocean exploration, science beginning to systematize its methods. Sixth civilization, the Industrial Revolution through modernity. Explosive growth, fossil fuels, electronics, atomic energy, spaceflight, the internet. This is us, right now. Thinking we are at the pinnacle, that we have finally broken the cycle, that we understand enough to avoid collapse. But maybe we are just at the peak of the sixth civilization, and the seventh is yet to come. Or maybe we are already the seventh if we count differently. Maybe the dark ages were longer than we think, and medieval Europe was already rebuilding from a more complete collapse. The numbering doesn't matter. What matters is the pattern. What if history is not a straight line but a spiral? Each civilization climbing higher than the last, but on the same essential path, facing the same challenges, making the same mistakes. What if the Sumerian king list, the Hindu yugas, the Greek ages of man, the flood myths, what if they are all trying to tell us the same thing? Asterisk, you are not the first. You are not unique. This has happened before. It will happen again. Unless you learn. Unless you remember. Unless you break the cycle. Your eyes are heavy now. Your breathing has slowed. The ancient world feels very close, and yet very far away. What would it mean for us right now, in our moment, if we took this cyclical view of history seriously? It would mean we are not on an inevitable march of progress. It would mean that everything we have built, our cities, our technologies, our institutions, our knowledge is fragile, temporary, and subject to collapse, just like everything that came before it. This is either terrifying or liberating, depending on your perspective. Terrifying because it means our civilization could end. Not might end, but could end, has ended before, and will likely end again. All our works, all our achievements, potentially lost to time, preserved only as fragments, as myths that future civilizations will barely understand. Liberating because it removes the burden of permanence. We don't have to build forever. We don't have to achieve immortality for our culture. We only have to do what every civilization does. Rise as high as we can, preserve what is most important, pass forward what we are able, and trust that the cycle will continue with or without us. Ancient peoples understood this. They built for the ages. Yes, the pyramids, the ziggurats, the megalithic temples were all built to last. But they also knew impermanence. They encoded their most important knowledge not just in stone, which could be destroyed, but in story, which could survive in human memory even when all physical traces were gone. The flood myths themselves are a form of preservation. They say, pay attention, this happened before. It destroyed everything. But some survived, and because they survived, you exist now. And because you exist, you can survive the next time. Learn to build boats. Learn to preserve seeds. Learn to remember the important things. Not the names of kings, not the boundaries of empires, but the patterns, the cycles, the knowledge that everything rises and falls and rises again. Modern archaeology is beginning, reluctantly, to acknowledge that the neat timelines we've constructed might be oversimplified. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe forced a complete reconsideration of when humans first built monumental architecture. We thought it required agriculture, settled life, a social surplus. But Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers. They organized, they quarried massive stones, they carved intricate symbols, they created sacred space. All before they farmed. Why? What motivated them? And what else did they do that we haven't found yet? Underwater archaeology off the coast of India has revealed structures that some researchers date to 9,000 years ago or earlier. Submerged cities, or natural formations that look eerily like cities. The debate continues. In the Amazon, LiDAR technology is revealing vast networks of settlements hidden beneath the rainforest canopy. What we thought was pristine wilderness turns out to be a landscape heavily modified by pre-Columbian peoples on a scale we never imagined. Our picture of the past keeps changing, keep expanding. Every few years, some discovery pushes back the timeline of when humans first did X. When we first made art, when we first made complex tools, when we first buried our dead, when we first domesticated wolves into dogs. We keep finding that humans were sophisticated far earlier than we previously thought. Which raises the question, how much earlier? If we have been behaviorally modern for 50,000 years, and we only have clear archaeological evidence for complex civilization going back 10,000 years, what happened in the other 40,000? Were we really just wandering around, barely surviving, for a period 4 times as long as all of recorded history? Or did we build things, learn things, create things that were lost, erased by the flood, by time, by the simple fact that most of what humans make decays and returns to the earth? Wood rots. Cloth disintegrates. Leather decays. Bone turns to dust. Even stone crumbles, eventually. After 10,000 years, precious little remains. After 20,000, virtually nothing survives the relentless grind of time. If a great civilization flourished 30,000 years ago, we would find almost no trace of it, unless they had the foresight and the means to build in stone on a truly massive scale. And even then, after millennia of erosion, we might gaze upon their magnificent ruins and mistake them for mere natural formations, cliffs and crags carved by wind and water. The past is not some well-preserved book we can simply open and read. It is a whisper, faint and nearly lost, a signal distorted by the deafening noise of millennia. Close your eyes fully now if you haven't already. Let the darkness behind your eyelids become the darkness of deep time. Imagine the Earth as seen from space, rotating slowly, 1 full turn every 24 hours. Now speed it up 1 rotation per second. Watch the continents drift and reshape themselves. Watch the great ice sheets advance and retreat like a slow, frozen tide. Watch coastlines rise and fall with the melting and freezing of the world. Somewhere down there, on those shifting landmasses, humans are living. They are building, creating, loving, dying, and being born. Zoom in. Slow the torrent of time. A settlement appears on the landscape. First, a few simple huts, then more. These give way to stone buildings, formidable walls, soaring temples. A city. Watch it thrive for a few hundred years. See the trade caravans like lines of ants coming and going. See the fields of golden grain that surround it, a testament to its prosperity. People are living their lives, entirely unaware they are just one small part of an immense, repeating cycle. Then something happens. It's too fast to see clearly. Exactly. What was it? A shift in the climate, a brutal invasion, a silent plague, a consuming fire. The city empties. Its grand buildings crumble into dust. Sand buries them. Or perhaps it is jungle vegetation, or the slow encroachment of water. Within a mere 1,000 years, barely a trace remains. Speed up time again. Watch the cycle repeat. Different place, different people. Same fundamental pattern. Rise, fall, silence. Rise, fall, silence. Over and over and over, across the endless tapestry of the millennia, we are watching the very breathing of civilization itself. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Let your own breath mirror this rhythm. Perhaps each cycle is a little different. Each new civilization reaches slightly higher, or lasts slightly longer, or preserves a little more of what came before. But the fundamental pattern holds. And here we are, in our own fleeting moment, in our own civilization, convinced that we are different. We believe we have finally broken free from the cycle, that we have achieved a kind of escape velocity that will allow us to rise forever. But the earth continues its silent, patient turning. The cycles continue to cycle. And in the hushed halls of our museums, ancient clay tablets keep whispering their solemn warning. Asterisk, this has all happened before. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote it down, preserved it in clay, and passed it forward through the ages. They presented it not as a prophecy of doom, but as a simple fact of existence, a truth too important to ever forget. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, and the survivors remember. Life, in its tenacity, continues. And perhaps, just perhaps, each cycle truly does preserve a little more than the last. Each civilization passes forward a little more knowledge. Each collapse teaches the survivors something new, something profound about resilience. If this is true, then we are not doomed to an endless, meaningless repetition. We are spiraling upward, slowly, painfully, but upward nonetheless. The first civilization learned to farm. The second learned to write. The third learned to build enduring structures in stone. The fourth learned to work metal. The fifth learned how to preserve knowledge across the chasm of a dark age. The sixth civilization, our civilization, has learned to industrialize, to digitize, to spread information globally in ways that might, just might, survive even a catastrophic collapse. That seventh civilization, whatever and whenever it might be, will stand to inherit all of this, all our accumulated knowledge encoded in a million different ways, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. That is, if we do our job. If we preserve what truly matters. If we pass forward not just our technology, but our wisdom. Now, let us explore the mechanics of collapse. The physical processes that could reset civilization and leave our descendants starting over from scratch. Picture the Earth from above, from the sublime perspective of the International Space Station. That fragile blue marble, swirled with white clouds, spinning silently against the infinite black, seems beautiful, peaceful, eternal. But zoom in closer. Look at the scars. The impact craters, though most are ancient and heavily eroded. The vast volcanic calderas, some sleeping, some merely dormant. The fault lines spiderwebbing across continents, grinding slowly, relentlessly building pressure. The Earth is not peaceful. It is dynamic, even violent on geological timescales, capable of reshaping itself in ways that make human civilization seem like little more than morning frost, destined to evaporate when the sun truly rises. Consider the Toba supereruption, approximately 74,000 years ago. Mount Toba in Sumatra exploded with a force equivalent to several thousand of our most powerful nuclear weapons, ejecting some 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash and rock into the atmosphere. The volcanic winter that followed may have lasted for 6 to 10 years. Global temperatures plummeted by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Genetic studies suggest that the human population may have crashed catastrophically during this period. Some researchers propose it fell to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals worldwide. While this population bottleneck theory remains debated among geneticists, the event would have been an apocalypse for any existing human cultures. If humans had developed any sophisticated societies before Toba, complex social structures, early agriculture, proto-cities, they would have been utterly obliterated. The few survivors, scattered in small, desperate bands, would have had to rebuild everything from the most basic principles of survival. And all memory of what came before would curdle into myth. Asterisk, once, our ancestors lived in great settlements. Then the sky darkened, and the winter never ended. Only a few of our families survived. Asterisk after generations of oral transmission. This story becomes asterisk. The gods were angry and destroyed the world with darkness and cold. Asterisk the specific mechanism, a supervolcano, is lost. But the pattern remains. There was a before. There was a destruction. There is a now. Toba erupted 74,000 years ago, long before any civilization we officially recognize. But supervolcanoes erupt on cycles measured in hundreds of thousands of years. The Yellowstone caldera, for instance, erupts roughly every 600,000 to 700,000 years. Its last major eruption was 640,000 years ago. We are drifting closer to another cycle. If Yellowstone were to erupt today with the force of its previous cataclysms, it would bury much of the North American Midwest under several feet of ash. Crops would fail on a global scale. Livestock would die. Respiratory diseases would spike. The ash cloud would circle the globe within weeks, dimming the sun and causing temperatures worldwide to plummet. Our modern civilization, with its intricate global supply chains, its complete dependence on industrial agriculture, and its densely concentrated urban populations, is more vulnerable to such a catastrophic disruption than any society that has ever existed. Within months, food shortages would trigger widespread conflict. Governments would struggle to maintain order. Power grids would fail as ash clogged the machinery of coal plants and solar panels alike. The internet, that miraculous repository of all our knowledge, depends entirely on a steady supply of electrical power and functional servers. If the catastrophe lasted long enough, say 5 to 10 years of volcanic winter, much of our complex infrastructure would collapse. Billions could die. The survivors would be scattered, isolated, forced back to subsistence living. And after a few generations, after the volcanic winter finally ended and the scattered survivors began to rebuild, what would they remember? They would remember a time before the darkness, when great machines flew through the air. A time when food came from stores, not from hunting and gathering. A time when humans could speak to each other across vast distances through glowing screens. They would tell their children about this old world, and their children would tell their children. And after 10 generations, after 20, the stories would have shifted. The machines that flew would become great metal birds, perhaps, or the chariots of the gods. The glowing screens would become magical seeing stones. The old world would transform into a mythical golden age, when giants or gods, or ancestors with unimaginable powers walked the earth. Eventually, someone would write these stories down, and someone else, thousands of years later, would read that text and declare, "These are just myths, exaggerations, symbols." Surely, they didn't mean any of this literally, and the memory of our civilization would become what the Sumerian king list has become to us. A mysterious text filled with impossible claims, preserved only because it feels important, but no longer fully understood. This is how knowledge is lost. Not all at once in a dramatic burning of libraries, but gradually, through disruption, through generational drift, through the simple fact that oral tradition distorts and transforms over time. But some things survive. The core patterns survive. The knowledge that there was a before and a catastrophe and a rebuilding. The deep awareness that this has happened before and that it might happen again. If you are still awake, take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress. You are safe right now in this moment. The catastrophes we are discussing are possibilities, not certainties. They are distant thunder, not a present storm. Let's consider another mechanism of collapse. Climate shifts. The Earth's climate is not inherently stable. It oscillates between long ice ages and shorter interglacial periods on cycles of roughly 100,000 years, driven by subtle variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, the Milankovitch cycles. For the past 11,700 years, we have been living in a remarkably stable and warm interglacial period called the Holocene. It has been a climatic sweet spot, with moderate temperatures perfect for agriculture and the development of civilization. But the Holocene will not last forever. At some point, perhaps thousands of years from now, or perhaps sooner, if we have disrupted the climate system beyond a critical tipping point, the ice will return. Or the opposite might happen. Runaway warming could render large parts of the Earth uninhabitable. Either scenario would force a massive human migration. Climate refugees numbering in the billions would surge across the globe, competing for the remaining habitable land and resources. Wars, famines, and plagues would follow in the wake of weakened, malnourished populations. Civilizations have collapsed from climate shifts far less dramatic than a full glacial transition. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC coincided with a prolonged period of drought in the eastern Mediterranean. Cities dependent on agriculture in marginal lands simply couldn't sustain their populations. Intricate trade networks broke down. Complex societies fragmented into smaller, simpler ones. The collapse of the classic Maya civilization around 900 CE corresponded with an extended, severe drought in the Yucatan Peninsula. Great cities like Tikal and Calakmul were abandoned. The population crashed, and the survivors reverted to a simpler village-level organization. The Western Roman Empire declined during a period of cooling and plague. The medieval warm period, from about 950 to 1250 CE, saw European civilization flourish. The subsequent Little Ice Age, from about 1300 to 1850 CE, brought famines, political instability, and the Black Death. Climate has always shaped civilization, and climate changes with or without human influence. Now, imagine a worst-case scenario, multiple stresses converging at once. A supervolcanic eruption triggers abrupt climate disruption. A pandemic disease spreads like wildfire through weakened populations. Agricultural failure leads to widespread conflict and war. A massive electromagnetic solar storm destroys our electrical infrastructure. An asteroid impact, small enough not to cause total extinction but large enough to devastate a continent. Any one of these events could severely damage modern civilization. Several happening in close sequence or simultaneously could cause a total systemic collapse. And this leads us to an uncomfortable truth. We have both historical and geological evidence that such devastating convergences are not theoretical. They have happened before. Around 536 to 540 CE, something catastrophic occurred. Tree ring data from around the world shows an extreme climate anomaly, the worst in at least 2,000 years. Historical accounts from Rome, Constantinople, and China describe the sun dimming for over a year, crops failing, a year without a summer. This event coincided with the plague of Justinian, which may have killed up to half the population of the Mediterranean world. What caused the 536 event? Possibly a massive volcanic eruption, possibly an asteroid or comet impact, possibly both. We're still not certain. But the effects were clear. The classical world, already in decline, was pushed over the edge. The Dark Ages deepened. Knowledge was lost. The population collapsed. Took centuries to recover. And that was a relatively minor catastrophe by geological standards. Earth has experienced far worse. The Younger Dryas event, about 12,900 years ago, saw global temperatures suddenly plunge, returning the planet to near-glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. The cause remains hotly debated among scientists. Some evidence has been interpreted to suggest one or more meteor impacts over North America, triggering massive wildfires and catastrophic climate disruption, though this hypothesis is contested. Other researchers point to a disruption of ocean currents or volcanic activity. Whatever the trigger, the climate shift was dramatic and global. Any human cultures existing at that time would have been devastated. And this event occurred right at the end of the last ice age, precisely when sea levels were beginning to rise, drowning coastal settlements around the world. If there were sophisticated human societies 13,000 years ago, not necessarily civilizations with writing and cities as we define them, but perhaps complex maritime or hunter-gatherer cultures with extensive knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and architecture, the Younger Dryas would have annihilated them. This remains speculative, as we lack direct archaeological evidence, but the scenario helps explain certain persistent patterns in global mythology. The survivors would have scattered. Their sophisticated knowledge would have fragmented. And after 1,000 years of climate chaos, when stable conditions finally returned and the Holocene began, their descendants would have started the slow process of rebuilding with only fragments, with hazy memories, with what could only have become myths of ancestors who knew the secrets of the stars and built in Cyclopean stone before the world ended. These are myths like those preserved in the Sumerian king list, like the concept of the Hindu yugas, like the flood stories found in cultures worldwide. Whether these are faint cultural memories of actual cataclysmic events or independent psychological constructions remains a topic of debate. Some researchers interpret them as memories encoded in the only format that can survive true catastrophe. Human narrative, passed from generation to generation, slowly transforming from history into myth, but retaining the essential patterns of the original events. Others see them as universal human responses to common experiences. Floods, fires, natural disasters, generational decline, projected onto a cosmic timescale. The evidence, in its ambiguity, supports elements of both views. Close your eyes if they are still open. Let these possibilities settle like dust after a storm. You don't need to remember all the details, just the pattern. Just the awareness that the Earth is dynamic, that climate shifts, that catastrophes happen, that civilizations are far more fragile than we like to believe. And yet, life continues.
Humans surviva.
We are a remarkably resilient, adaptable, and innovative species when necessity demands it. The question is not whether a catastrophe will come again. Geological and astronomical certainty tells us it will, eventually. The real question is what we will preserve, what we will pass forward, what we will encode for the survivors to find. Let your breath deepen. Feel yourself sinking into sleep, into the realm of dreams, into that timeless space where past and future collapse into the eternal present. The difference between technology and wisdom is crucial here. Technology is knowing how to do things. Wisdom is knowing which things are worth doing. We have excelled at technology. We have built machines that can think, that can fly to other planets, that can map the human genome. But wisdom, the knowledge of how to live in balance with our world, how to avoid the destructive cycles of empire and collapse, how to sustain rather than simply consume, that is far harder to acquire. That is the ultimate lesson every previous civilization failed to fully learn. Maybe that is why they fell. Not because they lacked technology, but because they lacked wisdom. Yet, before we move toward our closing thoughts, let us examine more closely what the ancient world tried to preserve, and how they preserved it. Because their methods might teach us what we, in turn, should preserve for those who come after us. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, massive stone structures engineered to last for eternity. And they have lasted, relatively speaking, 4,500 years and counting. But what knowledge do the pyramids truly preserve? Not writing primarily. The earliest pyramids contain no texts at all. Later ones have hieroglyphic inscriptions, but these are religious formulas, spells for the afterlife, instructions for the soul's journey, not blueprints for building a civilization. The pyramids preserve knowledge through their very form, through mathematical ratios, through precise astronomical alignments, through engineering principles embedded directly in the stone. The Great Pyramid's dimensions have been analyzed for complex mathematical relationships. Some researchers argue they encode the constant pi, while others attribute such relationships to coincidence or selective measurement. The sides, however, align almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. This is verified. Its internal shafts point towards specific stars as they would have appeared in the sky during the Pyramid Age. This is also documented. Whether these alignments were intentional repositories of knowledge or served purely ceremonial purposes remains a matter of interpretation. But consider this. If you wanted to preserve knowledge for a civilization 10,000 years in the future, a civilization that might not speak your language, that might not even possess writing, how would you do it? You couldn't use books. Paper decays. Even stone tablets can be destroyed, burned in kilns, or ground to powder for new construction material. But you could build something massive, unmistakable, aligned to astronomical constants that do not change. You could encode mathematical ratios in the structure itself. Anyone with mathematics in any era would recognize pi phi the square root of 2. You could build it with stone that would last for tens of thousands of years. And you could make it so obviously artificial, so clearly designed with profound intention, that future civilizations would be compelled to study it, to measure it, to try and understand what the builders knew. This is knowledge preservation through monument. It's not efficient, most of the nuanced knowledge is lost. But the key ratios, the astronomical alignments, the hard evidence that someone built this with sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge, that survives. The megaliths of Europe, Stonehenge, Karnak, Newgrange, serve similar functions. They are astronomical observatories built in stone, calendars designed to track the solstices and equinoxes. They preserve knowledge through alignment. Newgrange in Ireland is over 5,200 years old, older than the Great Pyramid. Once a year, on the winter solstice, a beam of sunlight penetrates through a carefully designed roof box and illuminates the inner chamber. For 17 minutes, light floods a space that is otherwise pitch dark year-round. This is knowledge preservation in its purest form. Asterisk, the sun returns. The days will lengthen again. Life continues. Asterisk, even if every word of the builder's language was lost, even if their entire civilization collapsed and their descendants forgot who built Newgrange or why, the light would still arrive on the winter solstice. And people would gather. And they would remember. The Inca preserved knowledge through quipu, knotted strings that encoded numbers and possibly even phonetic information. Most of this knowledge was lost when the Spanish conquistadors destroyed them, believing them to be pagan objects, but the concept survived, along with fragments of how to read them. The Aboriginal Australians preserved knowledge through songlines, complex oral traditions linking stories to physical landscapes. To walk the land is to sing the song, and to sing the song is to remember the law. This system preserved detailed environmental and cultural knowledge for over 40,000 years, far longer than any written tradition on Earth. The method was perfectly adapted to Australia's ecology. On a continent prone to wildfires, where physical structures decay quickly and where populations were nomadic, writing on fragile materials would never have survived. But songs, stories, and dances, these could be carried in human memory, practiced regularly, and taught to each new generation. The stories encode practical knowledge. Where water sources are located, which plants are edible, when animals migrate, how to navigate vast distances using the stars and landforms. This is wisdom preservation through culture, through practice, through making knowledge so sacred that forgetting it would be not just impractical but blasphemous. Perhaps the Sumerian king list served a similar function. It is not a practical document. Knowing that Alulim ruled for 28,800 years doesn't help you plant crops, navigate rivers, or cast bronze. But the act of copying it, of preserving it, of teaching young scribes to memorize it, this keeps scribal traditions alive. It preserves the profound concept that there was a deep past, that time extends far beyond living memory, that the world has changed and might change again. It preserves historical consciousness, the awareness that we are part of something larger than ourselves, larger than our city, larger than our generation. And historical consciousness is the foundation of civilization. Without it, you are trapped in the eternal present, unable to learn from the past or plan for the future. The king list says, * you are part of a long chain. Others came before you. Others will come after you. Your actions matter beyond your own lifetime. * this is wisdom disguised as mythology. It is truth encoded in impossible numbers. Now, think about our civilization. What are we preserving? What will survive us? Our digital records, billions of texts, images, and videos containing effectively all of human knowledge, depend entirely on electrical power and functional computers. If both were lost simultaneously, the vast majority of our information would become inaccessible within a single human lifetime. Hard drives degrade. SSDs lose their charge. Magnetic tape deteriorates. Optical discs delaminate. Even archival quality storage media might last a few hundred years, not thousands. And even if the storage media survived, you would need compatible hardware and software to read them. The digital dark age is a real and pressing concern among archivists. Files from the 1980s are already becoming difficult to access simply because the hardware and software required to read them no longer exist. So what will survive a major collapse of our civilization? Stone if we choose to carve it. Ceramics if we fire them. Glass if we make it thick enough. Certain metals if we alloy them correctly. But we no longer encode much of our essential knowledge in these durable media. The Georgia Guidestones, built in 1980, were a modern attempt at this. They were massive granite slabs inscribed with messages in 8 languages about how to rebuild civilization. Maintain the population below 500 million, guide reproduction wisely, unite humanity with a living new language, and so on. They were controversial messages, certainly, and the Guidestones were ultimately destroyed in 2022, but the underlying concept was sound. Encode important principles in durable stone in multiple languages in a location where they might be found. We have sent messages into space, the Voyager golden records carrying images and sounds representing Earth. These might survive for billions of years in the vacuum of space. If anything ever finds them, they will know we existed, know some of what we knew, and hear our music. But for preserving knowledge for future human civilizations on Earth, we need something more accessible than spacecraft billions of miles away. Some scientists have proposed projects like the memory of mankind, storing information on ceramic tablets that could last for millions of years. Others suggest encoding data in synthetic DNA, which can remain stable for thousands of years and stores vast amounts of information in a tiny physical space. The Long Now Foundation is building a clock designed to run for 10,000 years, a monument intended to preserve the concept of deep time and encourage long-term thinking. These are good ideas, noble efforts, but they are tiny projects compared to the scale of human knowledge and the magnitude of a potential collapse. What will really survive, in all likelihood, is the same thing that always survives. Stories. Skills passed from hand to hand. The knowledge encoded in the very genes of our domesticated plants and animals. The modified landscape itself. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, the survivors would still have wheat, rice, and corn. Crops that took thousands of years of careful cultivation to create and that often cannot survive in the wild without human assistance. They would have dogs, cats, chickens, and cattle, species shaped by millennia of selective breeding. The very fabric of the biosphere has been woven with our knowledge. That, at least, might be a legacy that endures. Let these thoughts dissolve now, like salt in water, present, yet not overwhelming. Your breathing has slowed, your body has grown heavy, and the boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin. In this liminal space, this threshold between consciousness and dream, the ancient world feels palpably close. The scribes of Nippur are still at their work, their styluses scratching patterns onto tablets of wet clay. The colossal stones of the pyramids are still being placed, hauled up earthen ramps that will themselves leave no trace. The stars still will overhead, tracing the same celestial patterns they have followed for billions of years. And somewhere in that vastness, in that deep expanse of time, we are but a single breath. Our civilization, our fleeting moment, our consequential choices. A single inhalation in the long, slow respiration of the world. What will we exhale? What legacy will we pass forward? That is the profound question the Sumerian king list asks. It is the same question whispered through the centuries by the myths of the flood, the Hindu yugas, and the ages of man. You are temporary, but what you build can endure. Not the buildings, perhaps, not the machines, but the ideas, the principles, the patterns. The awareness that civilizations rise and fall like the tides, but that knowledge can survive if we encode it well. If we preserve it wisely, if we teach our children to remember even what they cannot yet understand, so they can pass it to their children, and their children's children, until some distant age when the meaning becomes clear again. When the cycle turns, and humanity rises once more from whatever flood has swept over us. The Hindu texts speak of the Satya Yuga, the golden age, when humans lived for thousands of years. This longevity was not due to medicine or technology, but to dharma, righteousness, cosmic order, living in harmony with universal law. In the Kali Yuga, our present age, lifespans are short precisely because Dharma has declined. We have forgotten the cosmic order. We believe we can conquer nature rather than cooperate with it. The Sumerians built a magnificent civilization in a harsh desert by learning to cooperate with water, to channel it, to share it. But over time, their own irrigation systems salinized the soil. They depleted the very land that sustained them, and their civilization collapsed into dust. The Maya built great stone cities in the rainforest, but their agricultural practices led to the deforestation of vast areas. When a prolonged drought came, they had no buffer, no resilience. The cities emptied. Rome conquered half the known world but exhausted its political and economic systems in the process. The empire grew too large, too complex, too corrupt to sustain itself. Every fallen civilization fell for its own specific reasons, yet they all share a common, haunting pattern. They exceeded their ability to maintain themselves. They grew faster than they could adapt. They consumed more than they could renew. And now we are doing the same on a global scale. We have built a civilization powered by burning ancient carbon, coal, oil, and gas, releasing in 2 centuries the stored sunlight of millions of years. We have altered the chemistry of the atmosphere, the acidity of the oceans, the stability of the entire global climate. We know this. The science is unequivocal. We are conducting an uncontrolled experiment on the only planet we have, and we have no idea how it will end. Are we the civilization that finally breaks the cycle? Or are we about to become just another layer in the archaeological record? Another cautionary tale for whoever comes after? The answer hinges on the choices we make now. On whether we recognize the patterns, whether we learn from history, whether we choose wisdom over mere technology. Whether we preserve what matters most, not just for ourselves or our children, but for the 7th civilization or the 8th or the 100th. For whoever inherits this earth after we are gone, they will dig in the ruins of our cities. They will find our metals, our plastics, our profoundly modified landscape. They will wonder who we were and what we knew. And if we have done our job correctly, they will find something else. Something more durable, something that survived the flood, whatever form that flood takes. Perhaps it will be a monument with breathtaking astronomical alignments and embedded mathematical constants. Perhaps ceramic tablets inscribed with essential knowledge. Perhaps DNA sequences encoding our genome and that of our domesticated species. Or maybe it will just be stories, passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, slowly mythologized but retaining an essential kernel of truth. Asterisk, there was a civilization before. They flew through the air. They spoke across vast distances. They built cities of light. They knew many things. And then they fell. The flood came, the climate changed, the systems collapsed. But some survived. And they left these things for us, seeds, knowledge, patterns, so that we could rebuild, so we could rise again, so we could learn from their mistakes. So that we, perhaps, could finally break the cycle. That is the true message encoded in the Sumerian king list, in the myths of the global flood, in the very concept of cyclical time. The message is not you are doomed to repeat the past forever, but rather, the cycle continues, and each time, you have another chance. Each civilization that rises from the ashes of the one before has the opportunity to learn, to make different choices, to build differently, to prioritize differently. We possess more tools for learning than any civilization in history. We can read Sumerian cuneiform. We can excavate ancient cities with incredible technology. We can analyze pollen cores and ice cores to see exactly how past climates changed. We can study the rise and fall of empires across continents and millennia. We can see the patterns with a clarity our ancestors never could. And by seeing the patterns, maybe we can choose differently. Not to build higher, necessarily, nor to conquer more or consume faster, but to build more wisely, to cooperate more effectively, to preserve more carefully, to think not just about the next financial quarter, the next election, or even the next generation, but about the next cycle. What will we pass forward? What will survive us? Not our buildings, not our banks, not our borders. It will be our knowledge, our stories, our understanding of how the world works and what it means to be human. That is what the Sumerians gave us. Simple clay tablets that survived 4,000 years because they encoded something true and important. What are we encoding? What medium will survive the next 4,000 years? Digital storage decays with terrifying speed. Hard drives fail. File formats become obsolete, locking knowledge away forever. The very media in which we store our entire civilization's knowledge is infinitely more fragile than a simple clay tablet. Maybe we need to think like the ancients again. Encode the most important things in stone, in story, in patterns so fundamental they can be recognized by any intelligent being, regardless of language or culture. The mathematical constants of the universe, the structure of DNA, the periodic table of elements, the basic facts of cosmology. And alongside the science, the wisdom. The stories that teach us how to live, how to cooperate, how to survive catastrophe. These things, if preserved well enough, could survive a collapse. They could be rediscovered by the next civilization, helping them avoid our most tragic mistakes. That would be our greatest gift to the 7th civilization, or the 8th or the 10th. Not our technology, which they would have to rediscover anyway, but our wisdom, which they might not learn on their own. The understanding that civilizations are temporary, that the earth endures, that cooperation is the key to survival, that hubris always precedes the fall. These are ancient truths. The Sumerians knew them. Every ancient culture knew them. We have simply forgotten them in our frantic rush to grow, to expand, to progress. But the clay tablets remember. The myths remember. The patterns remember. And if we listen, if we pay close attention to what the ancients tried to tell us, maybe we can remember too. Let these last thoughts drift away now, like smoke from an ancient hearth, rising into the night sky and dissipating among the distant stars. But before we rest, before we release consciousness fully into sleep, let us visit one more place, one more fragment of the Great Pattern. Imagine yourself standing on the Giza Plateau in Egypt, before the Great Pyramid. Not in the harsh daylight, when tourists crowd the site, but at night, under the same canopy of stars that has watched over this monument for more than 4,000 years. The pyramid rises before you, a veritable mountain made by human hands. 2 million limestone blocks, some weighing over 80 tons, fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a razor blade between many of the stones. It is aligned to the cardinal points of the compass with a precision that deviates by a mere 3/60ths of a degree. For centuries, this was the tallest structure on Earth. It is a marvel of engineering that we could replicate today, yes, but only with enormous effort and our most advanced machinery, cranes, computers, complex mathematics. And yet, the ancient Egyptians built this with copper and bronze tools, wooden rollers, and rope. All techniques well documented in the archaeological record from the period. It was completed in about 20 years, according to conventional chronology, during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE. The methods are generally understood, though the logistics remain staggering. The standard explanation is a combination of human ingenuity and a massive, organized labor force, possibly 100,000 workers rotating in shifts, quarrying stone from far upstream, floating it down the Nile, dragging it up enormous ramps, and positioning each block with extraordinary precision. This is plausible. Difficult but plausible. Humans are capable of remarkable feats when organized and motivated. But stand there in the cool desert night. Place your hand on the ancient stone, feel its immense weight, its impossible precision, the sheer audacity of its creation, and ask yourself the fundamental question. Why? Why build something so massive, so precise, so extravagant in its consumption of human labor and resources? The standard answer is that it was a tomb for the pharaoh. But Khufu's burial chamber is small, starkly simple, and unadorned. No great treasure was ever found inside. No body was definitively identified as Khufu's. For a monument that represents decades of work by tens of thousands of people, it seems oddly empty. What if the pyramid's primary purpose wasn't burial? What if it was preservation? Some researchers suggest the Great Pyramid was designed to encode knowledge. When measured in specific ways, its dimensions yield ratios approximating pi and the golden ratio, though scholars debate whether this reflects intentional encoding or simply emerges from the geometric properties of its design. The internal passages do align with specific stars at specific times. The structure's proportions have been interpreted by some as a scale model of the Earth's dimensions, though these interpretations remain highly contested in mainstream Egyptology. Still, if you wanted to preserve the knowledge that the Earth is a sphere and encode its approximate dimensions in a structure that would last for tens of thousands of years, you might build something exactly like the Great Pyramid. And perhaps more importantly, you would make it so obviously artificial, so clearly designed with profound intention and sophisticated knowledge, that any future civilization would be compelled to study it, to measure it, to try to understand what its builders knew. Even if your language was lost, even if your civilization collapsed, even if every scrap of writing decayed to dust, the monument would remain, silent, patient, waiting for someone intelligent enough to decode its message. This is one theory. Mainstream Egyptology largely rejects it, pointing to the surrounding evidence that the pyramids were indeed tombs, part of elaborate necropolis complexes with temples, causeways, and subsidiary pyramids. But both can be true. A monument can serve multiple purposes. It can be a tomb and a temple and an encoded message to the future all at once. The point is not to argue that the pyramids were built by anyone other than the ancient Egyptians. The point is to recognize that the ancient Egyptians were far more sophisticated than we sometimes give them credit for. They thought in deep time. They built for eternity. They understood that their civilization might not last forever, but that stone would. And they were not alone. Around the world, ancient cultures erected monuments that seemed designed to outlast their own civilizations. Stonehenge, the megaliths of Karnak, the temples of Malta, the Nazca Lines, the statues of Easter Island. Each one represents an enormous investment of labor and resources. Each one seems calibrated to endure, and each one preserves knowledge. Astronomical alignments, geometric principles, and clear evidence of sophisticated surveying and construction techniques. Were these merely religious sites? Certainly. Were they also deliberate attempts to preserve knowledge for the future? Possibly. The line between the sacred and the practical often blurs in ancient cultures. A site that tracks the solstices serves both religious and agricultural functions. A monument that encodes the mathematical constant pi might be both a spiritual symbol and a mathematical lesson. Perhaps the ancients didn't separate these categories the way we do. For them, knowledge of the cosmos was sacred knowledge. Mathematics was divine. Astronomy was theology. Building a monument that preserved this knowledge was an act of worship and an act of preservation, entirely inseparable. And if that interpretation holds, then these monuments across the globe, built by cultures separated by oceans and millennia, with no clear evidence of contact, might represent parallel developments. Different cultures, independently arriving at the need to encode their most profound knowledge, or perhaps preserving patterns passed down from a common, even more ancient source. The archaeological evidence does not definitively resolve this question. We were here. We knew these things. We understood the cosmos. Remember us. Learn from us. Now shift your perspective. Move forward in time from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe. The great cathedrals rise. Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne. Massive stone structures that took generations, even centuries, to build. They featured flying buttresses, soaring vaults, and stained glass windows containing brilliant colors whose creation we still don't fully understand. The conventional narrative holds that these were built for the glory of God, to inspire awe, to lift the human spirit toward heaven. All true, but they also preserved knowledge. The stained glass windows often depicted stories from the Bible, yes, but also zodiac symbols, mathematical patterns, and alchemical imagery. The architecture itself encoded geometric principles. The golden ratio, sacred geometry, harmonic proportions. The medieval guilds who built these cathedrals guarded their knowledge jealously. Master masons passed techniques to apprentices through secret signs and symbols, rarely writing them down. The knowledge was considered too valuable to be widely shared, but it was encoded in the buildings themselves. Anyone who studied the cathedral architecture carefully could reverse engineer its principles, the proportions, the load-bearing structures, the geometry. It was all there, preserved in stone. And when the Black Death came, when the plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in the 14th century, when economic collapse and social upheaval followed, the cathedrals stood. Knowledge was lost. Entire guilds died out. Techniques were forgotten. But the buildings remained. Later generations studied them, measured them, and learned from them, rebuilding what had been lost. The cathedrals acted as vaults of knowledge preservation, whether consciously intended that way or not. They bridged the darkest of ages, keeping geometric and architectural knowledge alive through the worst demographic catastrophe Europe had ever experienced. This is the pattern. In every cycle, some physical structures survive the collapse, and these structures contain knowledge encoded in their very form, if not in explicit texts. After Rome fell, its aqueducts remained. Later engineers studied them, learned how the Romans managed water flow, and rebuilt similar systems. After the Bronze Age collapsed, megalithic structures remained. The people of the subsequent Iron Age didn't know who built them, but they knew those builders possessed knowledge worth studying. After our civilization falls, if it falls, what will remain? Our concrete and steel structures will slowly decay, but some will last for thousands of years. Future archaeologists will excavate them and learn that we understood chemistry, cement, metallurgy, steel, and electricity. From the ruins of data centers, even if the data itself is lost, they will infer the existence of power grids and information technology. They will find evidence of our vast transportation networks, roads, bridges, tunnels, and our water systems, mines, and quarries. And they will find plastic, that nearly indestructible testament to our petroleum age. Archaeologists 10,000 years from now will be able to identify the plastic era as a distinct geological layer, just as we identify the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And if we are wise, we will also leave something intentional, something designed to be found and understood. Not just monuments to our glory, but messages to the future. Knowledge encoded in durable media. Warnings about what led to our collapse. Advice for building more sustainably. The challenge is to do this in a way that transcends language and culture. We have no idea what languages the seventh civilization will speak. We don't know what symbols will be meaningful to them. But certain things are universal: mathematical constants, astronomical alignments, the structure of atoms and the periodic table, the double helix of DNA. If we encode these things, perhaps on ceramic tablets, perhaps in new monuments, perhaps within synthetic DNA itself, we increase the chance that something vital survives. That the next civilization doesn't have to start from absolute zero. That they find our messages and learn from us. Even if they don't understand everything, even if our most sophisticated knowledge is lost, the fragments would help. Even the mere awareness that a people before them knew these things could inspire research and preserve the concept that knowledge is worth seeking. This is what the Sumerian king list does for us. We don't fully understand it. We can't take the numbers literally. But we know it encodes something important about deep time, about cycles, about the relationship between civilization and catastrophe. And that awareness changes how we think about our own history. It makes us more humble, more aware of our own fragility, more interested in learning from the distant past. Perhaps that is all the ancient world could do for us. Plant seeds of awareness, preserve fragments, and hope that we would be wise enough to recognize their significance. And perhaps that is all we can do for the future. Preserve what we can, encode what we consider most important, and hope that whoever comes after will find it, study it, and learn from it. We cannot control whether our civilization survives. There are too many variables, too many potential catastrophes beyond our control. But we can control what we try to preserve, what we deem worth saving, what messages we encode for the future. And in choosing what to preserve, we reveal what we truly value, what we think matters most. If we preserve only technology, schematics for machines, chemical formulas, mathematical equations, we are essentially saying, this is what made us successful. Replicate these. But if we also preserve wisdom, stories about cooperation and sustainability, warnings about the consequences of overreach, principles for living in balance with the earth, we are saying something far more profound. We succeeded in some ways, but we also failed spectacularly. Learn from both. The second approach is more honest, more useful, and far more likely to help the next civilization avoid our mistakes. And maybe that is the real purpose of a cyclical view of history. It is not meant to make us fatalistic, to believe we are doomed to repeat the pattern forever. It is meant to make us thoughtful. If we accept that civilizations rise and fall, that ours is not immune, that catastrophe is not a question of if but of when, then we begin to think differently. We start thinking about legacy, about what we will leave behind, about what future humans will find when they dig through our ruins. We start thinking in longer time frames, not in quarterly earnings, but in centuries, not in election cycles, but in generations. We start asking the essential questions. What are we building that will last? What knowledge are we preserving that might survive us? What are we teaching our children that they can pass forward? These are the questions the Sumerian king list forces us to ask. These are the lessons encoded in the Hindu yugas, in the Greek ages of man, in the flood myths found all over the world. You are part of a cycle. It is bigger than you, older than you, and it will continue long after you are gone. Understand this, your civilization is not the first, nor will it be the last. Yet, what you do within this fleeting moment holds immense significance. What you choose to preserve matters. What you decide to pass forward matters. This importance isn't rooted in witnessing the outcome yourself, for you will not. The grand cycle of ages extends far beyond the scope of any single lifetime. Rather, its significance comes from your place in something far larger than yourself, a great, unbroken chain of humanity. This chain stretches back to the very first humans who tilted their heads back, looked at the stars in awe and wondered. It stretches forward to the very last humans who will ever live, who will inevitably gaze upon those same timeless stars and wonder still. You are a single, vital link in that magnificent chain, and its integrity, its very strength, depends on each link fulfilling its purpose. To preserve, to pass forward, to remember. The Sumerians fulfilled their role. They preserved their king list, embedding knowledge in humble clay. They built cities that endured for millennia and developed a form of writing we can still read today. The Egyptians, too, did their part. They erected monuments that defy time itself, encoded sophisticated mathematics in stone, and preserved the very bodies of their dead with such skill that we can still test their DNA. The Maya fulfilled their destiny. They charted the heavens with complex calendars, created breathtaking art and architecture that survived the relentless jungle, and left behind inscriptions we are still painstakingly deciphering. Each civilization, in its own time, plays its part. It contributes a unique thread to the grand tapestry, passes something forward, and then, inevitably, it falls. It makes way for the next, becoming another layer in the silent archaeological record, a collection of myths whispered in the next culture's oral tradition, a profound mystery for future historians to ponder. And this is not a tragedy. It is the natural order of things. It is the way the pattern works, the way the cycle turns, the way deep time unfolds itself. Like the individuals who comprise them, civilizations are temporary. But the essences they distill, knowledge, wisdom, the recognition of patterns, these things can endure. They can be passed forward, accumulating from one cycle to the next. So, even though we are not the first, and even though we too will fall like all the others before us, humanity is still advancing, still climbing, still learning. The seventh civilization, if we dare to number ourselves as such, inherently knows more than the sixth. It has access to a greater library of accumulated knowledge. It stands upon the shoulders of more giants. The eighth will know more than the seventh, and the ninth more than the eighth. Until, perhaps, a civilization in the distant future finally breaks the cycle. A civilization that at last achieves true sustainability, that balances its relentless growth with profound wisdom, its technology with genuine understanding, its progress with a deep and abiding humility. That will be the culmination. And whenever that civilization emerges, it will owe an incalculable debt to all who came before, to every culture that preserved a fragment, passed forward a flicker of knowledge, or encoded wisdom in stone and story. They will read our own version of the Sumerian king list, whatever form it takes, whatever medium we entrust it to, and they will understand. They will recognize the pattern in our history because they have seen it in others. They will see themselves in our cycle, feel the immense weight of deep time, and because of this, they will choose differently. They will build differently, think differently. Not because they are inherently smarter or more moral than us, but because they will possess the accumulated wisdom of every fallen civilization before them. Every mistake we made, every warning we encoded, every precious fragment we managed to preserve. This is the profound hope embedded within the cyclical view of history. That each turn of the wheel preserves a little more, passes forward a little more, until finally, the accumulation reaches a critical mass and the cycle is broken. Not through a final catastrophe, but through ultimate wisdom, through at last learning the lessons that every previous civilization tried to teach. We may not be that final civilization. We may, in fact, be destined to fall like all the others. But we can be the civilization that passed forward the crucial knowledge that helped the final one succeed. And that is a legacy enough. That is a purpose enough. That is a truth worth preserving. Let these final thoughts drift away now, like smoke from an ancient hearth rising into the vast night sky, dissipating among the stars. Our journey tonight began with a simple clay prism in a museum. 8 inches of baked mud, covered in wedge-shaped marks, telling an impossible story of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before a great flood swept everything away. We have traveled far from that single artifact. We've journeyed through Hindu temples and Greek philosophy, through flood myths that span the entire globe, through the great cycles of history and the rise and fall of ages. And we have arrived at a simple possibility, one that is both haunting and hopeful. What we call history may only be the latest chapter in a story far, far longer than we imagine. A story of civilizations rising and falling like tides, like seasons, like breath itself. We are not the first. We will not be the last. But we are here now in this moment in this civilization. And what we do with our time matters, even if our time is limited. We can preserve. We can remember. We can learn from the past and pass that wisdom to the future. We can build arcs against the coming flood, whatever form that flood may take. We can encode our most important truths in ways that might just survive us. We can look at the ancient tablets not with nostalgia for a lost golden age, but with the recognition that golden ages and dark ages are both inseparable parts of the pattern. And the pattern itself is neither good nor evil. It simply is. And within that pattern we have agency. The freedom to choose how we rise, how we fall, and what we leave behind. The Sumerians chose to leave us their king list. A chronicle of impossible reigns, a marker of the great flood, a thread of continuity cast into a future they could not possibly see. They passed the story forward. And here we are, thousands of years later, still reading it, still wondering what it all means. What will we pass forward? What will the 7th civilization find when they dig through the layers of our time? Will they find only the fossilized husks of our consumption, plastic and concrete decaying into inert sediment? Or will they find something more? Something that tells them who we were, what we knew, what we desperately tried to preserve? Will they look upon our ruins the way we look at Sumerian tablets, with wonder, with confusion, and with the nagging sense that something vital is encoded here, if only they could decipher it? These questions do not require answers tonight. They need only to be asked. And as you drift towards sleep, as consciousness fades into the landscape of dreams, let these ideas settle deep into your unconscious mind. Let them percolate, transform, and become something new. Perhaps you will dream of clay tablets, of floods and survivors, of new civilizations rising from old ashes. Perhaps you will awaken with a new perspective on our own fleeting moment in the great cycle. Or perhaps you will simply sleep well, wake refreshed, and continue living your life with a quiet, new awareness that you are part of something vast, ancient, and ongoing. Either way, the story continues. The cycle turns. And somewhere in a museum in Oxford, a small clay prism waits patiently for the next person who will pause, and read, and wonder. If this journey through the cycles of time resonated with you, helps other wanderers find their way to these explorations into the forgotten corners of history. More paths through the ancient world await in the playlist. Continue whenever you are ready. Share your thoughts below. I am always curious to know what resonates, and what questions linger in the quiet hours. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it may be, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.